I'd like to just formally acknowledge the Grasslands Trust for the awarding of the Ray Brown Award. Because of my era, many of you won't know who Ray Brown was. Ray Brown was the last director of DSIR Grasslands in Palmerston North. And Ray was a very large figure in that organisation in terms of grassland division of DSIR activities. And as Alan has said, I was a student here and colleague here as well, we came as students in 1970. We had a 4-year degree, 73, doing BAg Sci. And we were part of a year 1 intake of, I think, as my memory goes, but it'll be a bit fuzzy, 120, 150 students starting off doing BAg Sci. I think something like about 60 or 70 of those graduated 4th year in that year. And a very large proportion of us were employed in those days directly into MAF, the Ministry of Agriculture, as farm advisors. And there was a similar intake of students, Year 4 students coming out of Massey at the same time. And that was a feature of the recruitment into MPI for several years through the mid-70s period. And we all typically went into what was called the Extension Service or Farm Advisory or Consultancy Network. And obviously things changed as latter years. But my background was that we in government decided to get out of all that space, and around 1987 it started charging for services and got rid of extension services in 1995 when, as Alan says, we were purchased by Wright, or by Wrightson, and I've continued to work as an employee with Wrightson right through to retirement just recently. It's been a tremendous career. I've really never had never really had a significant boss that's told me what I had to do. I've been very free as a consultant to be able to pursue what we thought were the issues and the focus for farmers and farming community in our area, and in my case that's the Lower North Island. But in fact I've worked throughout New Zealand and in fact overseas as well, Colombia and a bit of stuff in Laos as well. So today I want to take a wee bit of time and share some observations that I have to really reflect on some of the experiences that I think I've had that I think it's important, in my opinion, that we don't lose sight of. So we shouldn't have to keep repeating mistakes, but increasingly we see that through society as things change, and we see that things change often for little real change. We keep seeing things come back. I want to share a few disappointments and concerns, and they're minor, but you know, I think the important thing is that overwhelmingly, as a consultant working with farmers in the rural community, the era that I've been working in has been incredibly exciting and interesting and great people that I've been able to work with. And that's, from my perspective, not just the farmers that I've worked with. I've had a very incredible involvement with the CRIs, a heap of scientists throughout New Zealand, from AgResearch, from Landcare, Massey University, and that's been a lifelong relationship that we've had you know, with working with people applying the results of research. I want to talk a wee bit more about some of those successes and achievements that we've made, and then conclude with some challenges and considerations that I'd like you to go away with. We'll just start with a bit of a video clip first. Okay, what's that got to do with why we're here today? I quite liked it because I saw it as being, in my mind, a bit of an analogy for agriculture, or where we come at with ideas and thoughts about system change within agriculture. We start with an idea, a seesaw on a border wall. And, you know, ideas are coming at all levels within agricultural farm systems, farm level. We typically have the idea, and we're not certain about the unintended consequences or how it will work out. Sticking a seesaw in the middle of a wall like that, how are the guards going to act? How are the people, what are going to be the unintended consequences? What's going to be the dynamic of the system in terms of making a seesaw will only work if two people play? The dynamics of it. And typically, if we use the Trump wall as an analogy for, typically we have imperfect vision, imperfect insight into what's going to happen when, for example, Derek first started talking about lucerne and dry land farming environments. The ideas and thoughts right at the beginning and where they've ended up with tend to be in quite a different complex of interactions. So we have ideas, but we don't have the full range, we don't have the full vision of what's going to happen. We have to suck it and see, and we have to think about what the unintended consequences might be. So I just see that as a bit of an analogy, and I think that it's useful to keep in mind. Yeah, our farming systems are incredibly complex, no matter how you look at them in terms of the dynamics. And I mean, that's the whole basis of the discussion of learning, starting point of learning here. But in reality and practice on farm, we're having to confront multi-seasonal issues. We compound that with price issues and implications at the same time. But underneath it is that biological dynamic that is occurring. There's a whole lot of rational and irrational drivers of behaviour, and if you think about everything that we're trying to do, it's about changing somebody's behaviour, what they're doing now, to something that's going to enhance some outcomes or improve the outcomes, whether it's economic, whether it's environmental, whether it's employment related, it doesn't really matter. But whilst we're doing that and trying to do that, and this is particularly where I want to share some more detailed thoughts today, there's a whole lot of distractions and distortions that influence and impact on those behaviours and those thinkings, and we want to emphasise that today, which all have consequences for behaviour. The first area I want to talk about today is a concern that I've had for quite a while, quite a long time, which is about this prevailing focus across agricultural systems towards reductionism, the simplification or of systems that results in what I'd call very intensive specialisation of a particular activity on a piece of land. And there's many reasons why that might be the case, why people are adopting that approach in terms of trying to focus the complexities of management and reduce those down to more manageable chunks. But it tends to be having, in my opinion, some quite significant negative implications for the system as a whole, and they're typically unintended consequences that when people think about taking a reductionist approach to the system, that they ignore. And some of those areas might be in the area of internal parasitism, which we're seeing significant issues as people go into these reductionist systems. What am I talking about? I'm talking about things like technosystem beef farming systems, where we're tending to have at most two, but often one age class of cattle only on an intensive pastoral landscape. We see it in terms of dairy farming, where we tend to have milking platforms that are only that. There's no young stock. The young stock are being taken off the platform. They're being reared in a separate block. So we have the situation where we have aged cows, and calving cows on one piece of landscape, and we have young stock being reared on another landscape. That has some pretty significant implications for issues around parasitism and certainly the development of drench resistance. But it also has a whole lot of implications around herd and flock health status. We've seen situations where we've had large, long-established sheep and cattle operations suddenly switching to, for example, bull beef as an example, but we could look at cropping the same, although it's not my area of expertise, but where they're suddenly importing. Instead of running 700 or 800 beef cows annually, they are now importing 3,000 or 4,000 Frisian bulls. And so the issues that arise, we've obviously got that current with Mycoplasma bovis, but the issues around BVD, issues around leptospirosis are quite significant in terms of what's been compromised in terms of the original high health herd status that we had on many farms, where the only animals they were bringing in were, say, replacement sires, bulls or rams. And so we're seeing this move to reductionism, to simplification. It's in the pursuit of profit in many cases, but it gives too little consideration. And as people working in agriculture, I think we need to give much more consideration to these issues, which are going to be fundamental to sustainability. Those features, as I've said, milking platforms, grazing blocks grazed by young cattle. We get these what I call rearing hotspots, and I sometimes see it with lucerne, for example, where people are consistently lambing down on blocks of lucerne, and in some areas that's giving rise to some pretty significant burdens we see recurring around nematodoros and issues like that. And so there's a whole lot of unintended aspects that come to this. One of the aspects of work that we've been heavily involved with is around internal parasite management. I'm not a vet, I'm an agricultural consultant, but we've done a lot of work looking at sustainable parasite management. And I just want to, for example, illustrate this point here. Back at the start of this decade, we were doing some work trying to pilot or demonstrate what might constitute best parasite management practice on farms. And one of the features that we ran across on farms in that situation was that there were a significant number of farms that were intensive dairy heifer support blocks. They were grazing dairy heifers. And so from the dairy farmer's point of view, this is pretty convenient. It's an easy way in which they could, subject to live weights being met, be farming out their heifers and getting back in calf cows in return. On some of these farms, and one of the farms in particular, there was heifers going there from 27 contributing herds. Right? They were contract grazing heifers from 27 herds. In many cases, the situation was that there was a basic animal health plan there, but one of the features, particularly for the sheep and beef farmer, or the previous sheep and beef farmer that was running, the farmer, was that the management of parasitism, for example, was under the control of the contributing dairy farmers. They would drench and use the products they chose, and they would drench at the interval they chose. There might have been a bit of quarantine drenching going on when the animals came on, but typically weren't the most effective products being used. And on some of those farms, what we identified were some very serious, hard-to-kill internal parasites. Moxidectin, which is the most potent EML, wouldn't kill them, triple resistant. And what was happening was that on those farms, those parasites, because the animals weren't exclusively grazed and farmed on, each herd wasn't farmed to an isolated area, there was co-mingling of grazing through blocks. What effectively is happening is biodiversity is well and truly alive. These resistant parasites that these farms had are going back each year to 28 contributing farms. Not only was the host farmer was ending up with a situation where their farm was effectively getting stuffed from the point of view of being able to control parasites because of the actions of other people. So, that might not sound much. In fact, that's incredibly significant and serious if we think about where we're at in New Zealand around anthelmintic resistance. So we have these features that arise once people get into some of these reductionist systems, and we've seen a large swing at the moment where, for example, quite a number of land court properties which have had closed herds have now gone into importing large-scale importation of Friesian bull beef as a replacement for existing Angus beef cow herds. And that's why. It's partly because, it's largely because they want to seek a higher level of profitability. What's really interesting is that those Landcorp herds, they were Angus herds, typically straight Angus, And some of us as old as me will remember people like Dr. Chris Morris and all the work that Chris did around crossbreeding of beef animals in New Zealand. And if they, instead of running Angus, had been running some dairy beef cross dams, herds with a terminal sire, I'm certain the issues that they have of low profitability in the existing herd and their basis, reason, their rationale for going to the bull beef there'd be much less of a gap. The existing herd structure would be much more improved. And Chris Morris did all that work in the 70s and 80s at Gowdies. So there's been a lot of work done looking at lifting beef cow herd profitability. Here, there's been a lump sum shift to moving to intensive dairy beef, and I would suggest it's a serious risk. There's a whole lot of things that we've done over the years which were built around looking at trying to think about integrated management and integrated advice. I was fortunate to be involved in the early 80s with the Veterinary Services Council, where we set consultants and advisors, consultants and veterinarians together to develop what we called planned animal health and production services. So trying to go out there with a mix of integrated advice so that farmers, the clients we were working with, were getting consistent advice around the type of behaviour changes they need to be thinking about specific for their business. Demonstrated very good benefits in terms of profitability and progress. And the point I'm trying to make is that there's a whole lot of stuff being done around this space that we can learn from, and we need not to forget. I talked about grazing systems, and I don't really want to go into the winter grazing, but you're all well aware of what's been going on in the last 6 months in terms of the pressures around and the media commentary around winter grazing and the issues around cow welfare in particular that have been flagged in that. But clearly there's some pretty fundamental issues there occurring in terms of soil structure, soil damage and long-term soil productivity as a result of some of those grazing systems as well. And anyone that goes through Southland at any time of the year and you look at the rows and rows of baleage stacked on some of those landscapes, one can see why we've got a problem at the moment. And that's not something that's recent. It's been sitting there for a long time and it's been discussed without any real solutions for quite a long time. But it suddenly hit the fan, in particular this year. I talked before about sorry, pointing that at the screen, getting old. Outsourcing rearing and grazing operations, dairy stock. I mean, the sense of bringing all these animals together on a rearing farm with, in many cases, inadequate quarantine procedures, with ineffective management practices in terms of parasite management, just simply creates real hotspots that we see time and time again. I don't believe it's, in many cases, good from a grazing management point of view, and certainly not from an animal health point of view. And from the point of view of disease management, it's ripe. And we need, and people get in a sense, they unfortunately get what they pay for. So this whole notion of reductionism, specialisation, we see it again, the same thing occurring in intensive lamb finishing operations, particularly under irrigation. Some of these systems have got some fundamental issues that are going to mean that they are not sustainable in the way they're set up. And we have to look at that and think about that, because the consequences are, in many cases, some of these farmers will not have to worry about the issues associated with climate change, because they won't be able to run the livestock grazing systems they've currently got simply because they can't control parasitism. It's that significant. But it's a consequence of this focus on simplification and reductionism, and I think that's pretty significant. Okay, the other area, I touched on soils, and particularly in Southland, but that's an issue in the North Island, particularly on our North Island mudstone hill soils as well. And this notion that I might have a 17-tonne crop of kale and I want to get a 32-tonne crop of fodder beet and I want to graze it in situ. you've immediately doubled the number of cow grazing days and hoof days that you've got on that block if you're going to graze it in situ. And what's that going to mean from the point of view of soil structural damage? And I'm aware of blocks and properties where they've been effectively buggered in terms of their subsequent pasture recovery or pasture establishment because of the amount of damage that's been done, not in an average winter, but it's how you cope with those seasonal extremes that particularly arise when you're dealing with such an intensive level of livestock grazing capacity. So soil and soil structure, I think, is fundamental in those cases, and we see it the same, particularly in the North Island, in relation to slope damage. Okay, and obviously the animal, I mean, this is the one getting the headline at the moment, but these other factors are, I would suggest, even more important. And we know, we've done a lot of work, a number of us, that have been helping farmers, when farmers know about the constraints of their soils, when they know about what constitutes good and bad soils and the properties of them and how resilient they are under management and adverse conditions, they will actually think very carefully about the farm system they put on that. And we've done a whole lot of stuff with farmers in the lower half of the North Island, from Ruatoria to Taumarunui South, looking at helping farmers themselves, not have an expert come in, but the farmer themselves map the soils in terms of management units on the farm and how they might think about optimising their farm management, firstly the design of their livestock policy, and secondly the management of those livestock and those soils to actually minimise the risks of doing long-term soil damage and how they can actually nurture it. And it's not until people do that sort of thing that they actually have the understanding, I believe, to then be able to cope year by year with whatever nature throws at them. But we know that, and we know that people will pick that up and learn it and actually behave consistently from that point on. So I want to move on and talk about what I see some of these rational and irrational influences on things. New Zealand agri-industry is very large, and there's a whole lot, and it's a very commercial model, but it's not unique to New Zealand, it's global. And so what we do see is that there's increasingly, I have some concerns about the number of commercial advisors that are out there that are really just salespeople. They're selling a particular product. I don't care whether it's a seed bank or it's a seed company, fertiliser company. I think the fertiliser companies generally do it much better, but some people are quite singular or narrow in their perspective that they bring to the advice they're providing to that farmer. We've seen it in terms of, in the previous decade, there was a strong focus on these short-term pastures, 2 to 3 year old pastures that people are constantly ploughing up in the pursuit of high animal live weight gain. The people that made the most money out of that, being fair, were the seeds company, but particularly contractors. And a lot of farmers, when they went into lamb finishing systems, didn't make a lot of money out of it because typically they could turn more lambs over in the season, but they typically had a big void in the August, September, October period where it was hard to make money unless they were in beef finishing systems versus lamb finishing systems. And so we need to be mindful that if somebody's selling me something, we need to be able to look at the nuts and bolts of it in a damn sight closer detail and think about the big picture. Well, how is this going to make a profitable difference for the farmer? We see some of these people specialising in, for example, regenerative farming or taking particular slants associated with an American soil testing laboratory or something like that, where they are pursuing a particular viewpoint. And so they're trying to differentiate themselves. And so we end up with farmers being sold some lemons at times. And we see that with a number, particularly in the fertiliser industry. I think one of the other drivers, it's rational, but it's expensive, is that farmers are time short. We all are time short. And so we all want quick answers, but just tell me the answer. Just tell me what I've got to do. Whereas in most cases, in agricultural systems, it's important to understand the principles and the dynamics of the type of management that has been provided. And too often that's skipped over. It's really important. And farmers, on the other hand, have to be prepared to pay for that. I'll talk more about that later on. Farmers need to be able to be prepared to pay for that advice so that they get something that's objective and independent. Too often, the farmer will say, well, I expect that from my seed rep because I'm spending $8,000 on seed. So I expect that advice. And it's all well and good that they should get advice from them, but they need to ensure that it's specific and purposeful for them. The same with animal health advice, and I'll touch more on that later on. And I think in terms of universities but particularly from the point of view of extension, but people that are involved in the business of extension, in our day, yeah, Christ, sorry, I apologise, but math was a tremendous employer. You know, we had a 4-year degree here, which really focused on ag sci, and then through math we had a tremendous amount of professional development that didn't really stop. And I see too little of that happening at a consistent professional level within the industry today. It's disappeared because people, you know, to go on a course for 3 days, if you're a commercial consultant, it costs you a bloody lot of money, foregone, you know. And so there are a lot of barriers there that we were fortunate enough not to have. But I think if we're thinking about what the government has signalled with, for example, the zero carbon bill and the money that they're proposing to levy on the industry whilst it's collective, as distinct before it gets to farm level, so 2025, I think they were talking something, Murray Doak would be able to nod his head, $60 odd million is something they were looking at putting towards extension, etc. Now, if there's going to be a resurgence in extension and technology transfer, there's got to be, we haven't got enough people to do it, but there's got to be a serious commitment to ongoing professional development of people in that space. It's really critical because it's no good just going out there with the quick flim-flam type solutions. It's having people that can understand the dynamics of farming systems, and it's being able to think about the unintended consequences before they become significant. So academic training and ongoing professional development is something that we've ignored to a large extent and we need to reinvest in seriously. So what are some of the distractions and distortions? You know, I've talked about some of the things that are happening there, but from the point of view of the people making behaviour change, or for whom we want behaviour change to occur, to be participants in that process, what are some of those distractions and distortions? And I want to now specifically, I'm sorry, I'm hammering parasite management, but it's been an area that we've done a lot of work in. And because I'm not a vet, I think I can talk about it. So parasite management, the advice and practice, the distractions and distortions around that, and the consequences for behaviour for people, I need to give a wee bit of perspective around parasite management and the way thinking has evolved. And think about this as being probably typical of any technology or any area of science as we evolve our thinking. Way back in the 70s, we had some new drugs come on the market, things like thibenzole. You won't remember that, but it's a white drench, and instead of drenching sheep with dry cleaning fluid, carbon tetrachloride, which usually killed them, the sheep rather than the parasites, we suddenly had products that were pretty safe to use. And so it was revolutionary, you know, it was like the first Leaf, Nissan Leaf, I suppose, you know. It's, oh, shit, we've got a car that you know. But then in the early 80s, we started really talking about, or this issue of anthelmintic resistance started to be raised by people at Wallaceville, Alec Blassoff and Ron Brunsden and some others. And in 1982, I came to a conference here at Lincoln which was really talking about that. It was the first time it really got talked about in a public forum, really. And then through the 1990s, with all the economic restructuring that occurred in the 80s and just the general ho-humness of agriculture, in that 90s period, getting out, recovering from that. It was just business as usual, and anthelmintic resistance got forgotten about. Not really, but it got ignored a lot. And then we've had, since it's the 2000s, we did a big national survey, Northland to Southland, looking at quantifying the level of anthelmintic resistance in parasites of sheep and in cattle. And that was a bit of a world first for cattle, and led to some other work being done in a whole lot of countries around the world, because really up to that stage no one talked about cattle parasite resistance of parasites of cattle to drugs. Okay, but what we found gave us the greebies, because there was some pretty significant nasty resistance issues there, much more significant than we thought. We being the royal we. And so what we did was say, well, what's life look like if you've got multi-drug resistant parasites on your farm, whether it's sheep or cattle? And this was sheep and cattle. So we set up what was called best practice, and we really had a big focus on that with the 23 farms from Northland to Tiana to see what best practice parasite management might look like, because we didn't know. And could we put something in place? And yes, we did, and it worked. So one of the things that we've been incredibly effective on as an industry, and I'm talking about the whole agricultural industry, we've been incredibly effective in developing anthelmintic resistance on farms. And that's not what we're meant to do. It's not what we want. But we've got some bloody serious issues in terms of multi-drug anthelmintic resistance in sheep and in cattle across New Zealand. And some farms are very serious. And it's here right now. It's not the future. Back in 1990 or 1982 when we talked about that conference, it was the future. We're there now. We've done it. So how's that happened when we actually know heaps? There's no lack of science. We've had 30 years of government and industry investment in this whole space around parasitism, parasite management. Sorry, I'm in your bloody way. Do you want to... You're right? Sorry, you're right? My problem. Oh, you can move up. I won't be upset. Okay. Right. We know a lot about life cycles and infection. We know about establishment rates, for example, of eggs into larvae from parasites shed by ewes versus lambs, and how that affects the dynamics of that. The whole dynamic of life cycles and infections and overwintering and all that sort of stuff. We know a lot about it. We know what happens when we drench adult stock, and we know that if we drench adult stock and give all the ewes on the farm, for example, or all the dairy cows, lactating cows on a dairy farm, that's highly selective for anthelmintic resistance compared to drenching calves or lambs. And there's a whole lot of work, both trials and modelling, that looks at that. We know the impact of using long-acting products, long-acting drugs, and how that affects the selection for resistance. And using long-acting drugs is incredibly selective or effective in speeding up the selection for resistance. And we tend to use long-acting drugs in sheep, Bionic capsules, moxidectin LAI. There are some products in cattle that do the same, but luckily we haven't got them registered in New Zealand. We know how and when we should be, what the role and power of combination actives, combination products is. We know that the best time to use a combination product, anthelmintic, is before you have drench resistance. It's most effective when we give it very early in the use of product. But there are people out there still advocating that you go through and you use one active and you use that until it's buggered, and then you switch to something that's going to work, that you haven't used for a long time, and you go till that's buggered, etc., etc. And that's not the way to use it. But there's still some people giving advice to that effect. We know that when we use some of these long-acting drugs in, for example, treating ewes, that not only do we end up with resistant nematodes, present and developing in the adult ewe, but the lambs, which haven't actually been drenched, but come weaning time, have been grazing on those ewes, those lambs will have a selected resistant worm population in them as well. So the lambs haven't been drenched, but because they've taken the drug either through across the placenta or through the milk that they've been suckling from the ewe, then there has been suboptimal dosing of the lambs with these drugs, and that's selected for resistant parasites. And so you can kill the lambs and you can pull out resistant parasites. We know concepts called refugia, which is about leaving, and how can we leave some worms on the farm, a healthy selection of worms that have not been screened recently by Anthelmintics, and how we develop that. We know that if we treat cattle orally, then the drugs will be highly effective and we'll have a high level of efficacy, but you put the same drug into the animal by a poron and the efficacy will be much, much poorer. And injections are somewhere in between. There's been a whole lot of work that's been done looking at the production benefits when, for example, we treat ewes with long-acting treatments. And one of the key things that come out of that is that the production benefit, there may be an improvement in lamb weaning weight, 50% of the time. There may be an improvement, more likely an improvement in ewe body weight. But we know that the number of lambs born can be incredibly variable, or the survival of lambs can be incredibly variable in those situations. In some cases, there are fewer lambs born to those treatments. In about half the cases, to be honest. We know that just because a ewe is skinny, given her a drench, that the skinniness may not be due to parasitism. In many cases it's not, and just given her a drench, only about a third of the ewes will respond. There's a whole lot around repeatability of results and what happens. We know that the results for much ewe treatment is quite unpredictable. And in most cases, feed's more important than treatment. So despite that, there's still a large commercial, big pharma promotion of use of long-acting treatments in ewes, and you would have seen all the adverts on the TV over the previous 5 months as we've led up to pre-lambing. There is a massive commercial interest promoting the treatment of ewes with long-acting treatments, and there's a whole lot of advisors, particularly in the veterinary industry, that are promoting and selling those products to farmers without sufficient consideration of the issues and risks that they face. We know that when farmers spend that money on those products, the only person guaranteed a return is the vet selling the product, or the OTC selling the product. The farmer, 50% of the time, will lose money. We also know that some tools like fecal egg counting, unless people are doing a larval culture, are a waste of time. So people will bring a fecal sample in, say, should I drench these ewes? Should I drench these lambs? Don't know. You can't tell, because it depends. It depends on the species present. It depends how well they're doing and growing and how well they're being fed. But typically it depends on the species, and the egg count, the threshold one might use will be significantly different for a ewe versus a lamb, and same with cattle. We know that in the North Island, it's not an issue you face here, but in the North Island, Homunculus, Barber's poleworm, is a tremendous tool to assist in the selling of some drug products. There's a specific long-acting treatment, with amoxicillin-based treatment, which will provide an extended period of protection against Barber's pole. Barber's pole is quite a traumatic worm in terms of causing clinical loss of stock, typically in the autumn, summer, autumn. And so if it's a real dry summer, then the advice generally is, well, it's pretty dry. When we get a bit of rain, the Barber's pole will be away and we need to drench. If If it's a wet summer, the barber's pole will be multiplying pretty quickly. I think we need to drench because there'll be plenty of barber's pole around. If it's a warm summer, good warm conditions for barber's pole, we need to drench. You get the story? You know, it's a commercial drive. It relies on farmer fear and concern because it is traumatic, a traumatic experience if one gets barber's pole. What we do know is when farmers follow certain practices, the level of barber's pole on the farm is quite insignificant. Not always, but very often. And we've had some good case studies that have demonstrated what we call good practice or best practice and the benefits that arise from that. And there are some examples around, and I'll use Landcorp before, but I'll use them again, because Landcorp's an example of very best practice being applied in the sheep industry. Landcorp, as an entity across its sheep farms, has very high levels of drench efficacy, very low levels of anthelmintic resistance. And that's because they've applied best practice for many years, and they've done certain things and not practiced others. And they contrast massively with the rest of the industry, where the level of anthelmintic resistance is so much more severe. So we know these things work. So, you know, we've had Wormwise, National Extension Program. We've highlighted emerging resistance. We've demonstrated all these things. And we've also evidenced where you put best practice in place. Sorry, I'll slip to Sky. Best practice, for example, constitutes these sorts of practices, and there's about 41 on this list. We didn't set it up that way, but as we worked through our best practice project, parasite management program, that's what we ended up with. And so this was a way of being able to rate a farm or rate the farmer for their compliance with best practice. And this reflects the change between the start of a project and where they ended up over a 4-year period. An example of it. We know that with best practice we can make a difference and we can make things go backwards. We can improve the effectiveness of drenches over time by applying best practice. And this was particularly for ivermectin and lamazole against osteotargia on these best practice farms. There's 8 farms there, and statistically significant improvement in drench efficacy over time. But as an industry, we have failed to change behaviour. And so there's some lessons here that I think we need to think about in terms of going forward. And these are lessons I think that are important for this topic, but it's an example or an indicator. I think it's symptomatic of the things we're going to have to think about in relation to whether it's nitrate use, nitrate loss, water quality, nitrate leaching, and we're going to have to think about in terms of traumatic efforts around, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. In the animal health arena, we've had simple new technologies came through, and they were always picked up very easy. And that simple new technology was a new drench, new active. You know, the simple thing to do when farmers are used to drenching is to give them a new drench. And in the start, about 2000, we thought there weren't any new drenches coming out, but 2 new drenches came on the market, first time in about 25 years. And in many cases, all that happened was farmers switched to using the new products without changing anything else. And all that has done has put the pressure on those new products and hastened their demise. So, you know, farmers will always go for the simple, but when in this case we had a simple alternative, that was what was, so there wasn't the necessity, there was the want, the need, but there wasn't the necessity to, when they introduced those new products, to actually make other changes to what farmers did, the new anthelmintics. We've had pretty mixed messages from people. We've had groups like ourselves working with farmers, making some pretty significant, very significant progress with the people we've been working with. And then there are other people out there in the industry, for example, the pharmaceutical companies and other people involved in that space, providing quite mixed messages to farmers. advice, whether it's around quarantine treatment, whether it's around treatment of adult sheep, it's about the use of long-acting products. There's a whole lot of mixed messages going out there. And some of those people are motivated as much by what they make out of selling the product. It's certainly not the risks and implications for the farmer. And I think if we were talking to a group of bankers here or real estate agents, and we're dealing with making a comparison with the financial advisors legislation that's come in, then if this was that area, there'd be a whole lot of people getting their arse sued off, I believe, around some of the advice that's been going on in this space. And whether it'll ever happen or not, but I believe personally that in the animal health arena, given the issues around resistance, particularly around the use of some of these long-acting products, whether we'll ever see a class action against Big Pharma, just as being talked about with codeine, etc., I don't know. But I personally believe the type of advice that's been given in many cases has been incredibly negligent, and it's failed to give the full picture, and certainly the implications for those farms where they've developed serious anthelmintic resistance are damn significant. So there's some pretty mixed messages, and I think we've had a pretty unregulated, and we have an unregulated industry. ACVM, agricultural chemicals, veterinary medicines, are really only interested in ensuring there are no residues left in the product that in the product from the animal you treat. They're not concerned about whether the product works or the level of resistance out there and the label claims that are made for it. They're not concerned about how it's being used. I think there's a real unwillingness in the industry, and veterinarians and other advisors, sellers of products are seriously guilty of this, but so are farmers. It's an unwillingness to assess risk factors and plan, and that typically takes time with the farmer working through what their situation is. You do it on farm. You get out on the farm and you work with them, and you actually see what they're doing in terms of grazing management, and you see what they're doing in terms of their practice and behaviour, and you understand better what they're doing. It's not giving them a recommendation from the office or over the telephone. But that takes time, and farmers have to be prepared to invest in paying somebody to come and work with them for that time. So it's a failure to advise. It's more about selling. I've talked about the conflict of interest around sales, which I see as really fundamental and that people need to be asking questions about every time advice has been given. And the final point is that too many cases we're using some of these products to treat something that is underfeeding rather than a parasitism issue. My animals are light, my animals are in light body condition, whether it's calves, whether it's cows, whether it's ewes. Why? It's typically because of a lack of feed, underfeeding, whether that's a fundamental system fault, whether it's they've been over-summering too many lambs too late and not culling early enough, whether it's fundamental issues around fertiliser management and application, a whole lot of factors. You know as many as those as I do. So we know I've hammered parasite management, but I'm using it as an illustration. The point we've made is that it's complex, but it's not complicated. Farmers are not dumb. They're bloody incredibly resourceful. And so when we explain, and when you explain the principles and what you're trying to achieve, the farmers can work out practical ways in which they can achieve that on their own farm. They get it. Importantly, it's about integrated management. It's the way we integrate sheep and cattle. I know farms now that are 50-50 sheep to cattle ratio, but they're monocultures. The cattle don't have sheep going through them. The sheep area doesn't have cattle going through it. Farms where it's only 1 year age group, 10, 12-week-old calves coming in, and they all go off the following summer, and there's another crop comes on. It's a monoculture of one age group. So it's about integrated management of age classes as well as species. You know, hoggets versus older ewes, calves versus cows, cattle versus sheep. It's about mixing those and getting the benefit of those in terms of grazing management, in terms of parasite management. Pretty simple. And it's important that people focus on evidence-based and impartial advice. So going forward, I think, the summary is that farm systems are dynamic and reductionism and monocultures lack resilience inherently in terms of the way I see it. And people focusing on those as a way to make money are going to come unstuck. We need farm system, emphasis on system skills and knowledge. And that's both at, I'll call it an academic or an initial level, but it's an ongoing need for that reinforcement and development. These externalities, whether it's animal welfare, whether it's wintering systems and the emphasis about that, and the environmental concern, whether it's nitrogen or greenhouse gas, whether it's parasitism and anthelmintic resistance, are here now and they're biting, and biting bloody hard. We need a fresh emphasis on advice and guidance that's objective and informed by best practice. And best practice isn't a recipe. Best practice is principle-based. It's not a recipe. It's not telling people what to do. It's telling them the principles that they need to think about and employ and how they can cope with the seasonal adversities and the changes that occur. And they're able to do that and make that decision-making themselves without you holding them. But farmers need to also up their game. And they need to have a better awareness of what these risks are, and they need to hold higher expectations of the people providing advice, but they also have to be prepared to pay for sound advice. And rather than the vet sticking a hand up the backside of the cow or shoving some antibiotics into them and saying, well, if it's not well in 3 days' time, shoot it, we need that money to be spent on the vet or advisors providing proactive advice, proactive management advice. Clinical at the bottom of the hill isn't that useful. It's necessary occasionally, but it's not that good of an investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for the very thought-provoking narration. I'm sure we have some questions.
Tony Murray Doak from NPI. You've referenced the fact that we have money now for extension, but I think what we're lacking is how to deliver and what do we deliver. Now, at the end here, you've identified some things that need to be done, but I guess it's about what's institutional we would wrap around that, because you point out farmers get it. So, in your experience, is there ways that are kind of very effective and cost efficient for those things that do the job, not recreate what we used to do?
One other thing, we're dealing with complex issues. I said that. And so that takes time for people, who are wanting to, people to change. And to build the skill, sorry, have I knocked something? Can you still hear me? Yeah. The skill and confidence and learnings that they need to be able to live that through, seasons. What we did with the best practice, I've enjoyed being a consultant because you were going back to clients and you can see progress over time. And so this need to have repeat or a form of repeat or regular interaction with the farmer was one, incredibly satisfying, but it was also, I think, a key to being effective in them understanding and changing and making a success of the behaviours, or successful behaviour change. So that means that I know what you can't have, I think, but I'm not certain exactly. I think that means that therefore there's a lot of ways you can do it. A short focused stint on, a 1 or a 2 year program doing this, focusing on this or that topic or whatever, is not the way to do it. There's got to be a sustained emphasis where both the person providing advice is improving their familiarity with what the farmer is doing. So there's a lot of it's one-on-one. You can stimulate awareness and interest through group activity, but it's about stimulating awareness and perhaps providing some exposure to exemplars. But in terms of people thinking about what's it mean for me and my farm, then that needs to be a more detailed approach. And the only way I've found out to do that well is with some engagement over time. And so you're going back, and so like that checklist I had up there, that multicoloured thing, and I said before and after, was that we interrogated's the wrong word, but it's probably the right. Interrogated the farmer to, didn't just accept what they said they were doing. You went back and looked at you evidenced it from their resources about exactly what they did do and how they did it. And because we all think, oh yeah, that's what I meant to do, it's the old mind thing. So we were quite deliberate about how well was the behaviour becoming embedded. And by providing feedback, it provided reinforcement. The other thing we did, nitrate I think is very much the same. A comment came up last Friday. Well, we're dealing with the topic, sorry I'm hammering parasites, but you can't see the bloody things, right? The farmer can't see them, so how does he understand? Can you help? Well, we actually did some things that helped them, in a sense, see what was happening with parasitism. Firstly, the number of farmers that know their drench efficacy status do a fecal count reduction test is sweet bugger all. Out of this room, there's probably 4 of you. Oh, that'd be too many. And they're a bit hard to do, more so in cattle, but they're all easy enough to do in lambs and in dairy stock, but harder to do in beef animals. But you can do a simple drench check. So, you do a simple drench check, which means they've drenched today, 10 days later they do another sample, right? That tells them how well the drench is working. That's a pretty good start, right? So that was quick and easy and dirty and done. But also, we had them being drenched every, say, 28 days. And so immediately before drenching animals, they've got a line of lambs in, they were drenched 28, 30 days ago, they take a sample out of them. Send the sample away, we do an egg count and a larval culture. We're not going to drench them on that basis, but what it tells us is how dirty were they, how parasitised were they. That tells us something about how dirty the farm is. And farmers, by doing that, could see how well the advice that we were providing and the way they were behaving was working. And it gave them really heads up if there were going to be any risky areas. So there were simple things like that we could do that enabled them to see, still couldn't see the worms, but they could see what things were happening like on their farm. And they could get a feel that, suddenly you've got a wee bit of confidence that this is working, So it's thinking about now I don't know how we do that with nitrate. We're stuck with models, and we have to go with that one. But we need to, so we've got, but that's the challenge, is can we break things down into things that enable people to get some progress markers along the way?
Can we just
interrupt here because I know there's a few more questions.
Hi Tony, Susan Watts from Ag Research. And it's really a follow-on from what Murray's asked you, but nowadays farmers are getting more and more data from a whole lot of sources, and it's more and more precise. How are you finding that they're sort of coping with this in terms of being able to process it and use that data to make decisions? And what can we do to try and help that process? What are the real tools that we can get to help change that decision-making process around the data?
I think the challenge is still getting data that is specific to their situation, to their locale. We've had a whole lot of stuff around, say, climate and weather, and we had with NIWA the old, Alzheimer's. Every 5 kilometres weather station. Virtual climate stations. And that I still think weather-related stuff's actually quite important from the point of view of early warning, heads up around management decision-making, because timeliness of decision-making is really important. And from my point of view with my clients, that was really important, but we had a particular bee in our bonnet around that. NIWA took that away from being so freely available, and I think that's a loss. But I think things like that enable people to bring those virtual climate stations in terms of soil moisture deficit brought together a whole lot of information that gave people some heads up. Your most obvious thing is rainfall, but then your next most useful thing was potential soil moisture deficit from a point of view of making decisions. And this is North Island Hill country. That's probably the most useful thing that could, if we could have that really specific to farms, would be real valuable in terms of early warning decision making. And because a lot of things in agriculture are about timeliness. Alistair.
Tony, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on unintended consequences, which you briefly mentioned at the start, of the increasingly regulated environment that we are getting into, particularly things like nitrogen caps based on grandfathering, and we're likely to see it in terms of greenhouse gases, which are actually locking farms into their existing systems and removing the flexibility to do things like changing sheep to cattle ratios.
Oh, we'll have a scrap here, Alistair. Not with you. I thought we've been pretty fortunate with the RMA in that it was an outcomes-based model of legislation, as distinct from the US or UK, EU stuff, which is around input prescriptive, you know. And so I have done a whole lot of submissions in relation to regional plans around Horizons and Hawke's Bay and Waikato, where I was supporting, have been supporting the notion of LUC-based nitrogen leaching limits, which really attacks very much the notion of grandparenting, and which provided flexibility for people, assuming that, you know, if it's the same landscape, it's got the same nitrogen leaching allowance, entitlement to discharge, irrespective of what your land use activity is, then I consider that to be the most fair and equitable way of distributing the right to discharge, and I still believe that. And that provided a pretty clear incentive or direction of which those that were above the allowance had to move, and it provided opportunity for those who were below that level of discharge to be able to move and consider what their options were, and to my mind it preserved wealth. And you know, I still would favour the argument of tradable nitrate leaching rights as well, because that meant that the person with the low level of leaching, which is well below the nitrate leaching limit, had the choice of either intensifying their operation or at least being able to capitalise some of that difference, some of that lowness that they had, and be able to sell that to somebody above. So I favoured that regime. And I think that's a desirable feature of the RMA that EU, for example, doesn't have. So there's a bit of a brick gone over the fence, I think.
Yes, I've enjoyed the talk immensely. It reminded me of the good old days of which I was a part, seeing golf
Yeah.
and research. And I was interested in your challenge how we're going to restore neutral and objective farm advice. Now, I think it's got a whole lot more complicated now if government is going where I think it's going, because that quality of farm advice is going to be about how to tailor production systems to minimise greenhouse gas production. So it's really not nice to have anymore, we've got to do it. So I'm encouraged to hear the Crown is interested in putting some more money into farm advice. It's not all about helping farmers, it's their agenda as well.
Oh, absolutely.
So we've got now a kind of shotgun marriage between farming and government, which is about time as far as I'm concerned. Do you have any feelings about that?
No, I think that's, I hadn't thought of it quite like that, shotgun marriage, but I think that's quite appropriate because government needs to be actively involved in that space. We've had too much distance. Who here is from beef and lamb? Okay. Well, we've had the, you know, sorry, was that a hand?
You're on video.
Yeah, I know. I have to be careful. But yeah, you're right. 87, you know, everything walked away. And I was involved with the monitor farm program and setting that up in 1990 with beef and lamb, and in those days there was a void of public dissemination of information to farmers. Government walked away, and I really think in many cases a lot of the beef and lamb projects have been quite superficial, and I think there is going to need to be a real integrated focus, I believe, whereby I would have loved to have taken on some new consultants or had some contracts either with MPI or Beef and Lamb that allowed us to take on some new consultants and mentor them through delivering some of the projects, but it was about, you needed the contract commitment over a period of time to be able to take people on board and take some of the financial risk out of it. And you know, in the old days, well, we just took them on board, but we need some economic mechanisms like that that enable people to be recruited, to be professionally developed, to be able to have a robust whole of farm perspective and to be able to go through professional development that will support that. And I think those entities have to recognise that the funding has to reflect that, not being just trying to screw the hell out of everything that's done and get £2 of flesh for £1 of input, if you know what I mean. That's been the model that's operated.
Questions? You have a question?
Yeah. So, I'm Neil from Agriculture. My question is about unintended consequences. They're naturally like they are something you don't know, right? And they're easy to analyze when you look back. But do we have any solution? Like, if we are developing something new, how can we tackle this? Because it's something you're looking in future and it's unknown.
Yeah, of course. I think, first of all, it's about assembling what I'd call multidisciplinary teams around any particular topic. And I've been fortunate to be involved in, I'll call them mentor groups and that sort of thing, with researchers where we've actually brought a complete range, a diverse range of skill sets together. So often we can speculate, postulate, hypothesise what some of those are. I don't think we go into too many situations where the unintended consequences were completely blindsiding. I think we have indications, we have hunches, if you put the right mix of skill, a good diverse mix of skills there, and perhaps oversaturated initially, and then do some intensive monitoring. So, you know, too often we see things thrown together, spray and walk away, you know. And so I think it's the way we set things up. Dave Leithwick, I've been proud to have been involved with Dave since 1998 in terms of parasitology, and we've had a mentor group that's largely remained intact that has involved consultants, vets, farmers, researchers, pharmaceutical company people, and we hammer the hell out of any issues well and truly before the trial's even set up, let alone extended. And I think that, you know, Ray Brown, you know, back in the days when I started, we used to have regional, I forgot the name, but there were regional science advisory days where consultants and all the science staff at DSIR and Math Tech in those days would come together. And we would spend 2 or 3 days chewing the fat around what we thought were either the latest research or the issues that we were seeing in the field. And you really had a multi-discipline, multi-people, multi-perspective approach. And that was how a whole lot of research was shaped and prioritised and driven in those days. We don't do that now.
I think we probably only have 2 more and then you're welcome to discuss with Tony afterwards.
Eva from Area Centre in Canterbury. Obviously you're talking about the reductionism and monocultures as being like, you know, high risk resilience and so forth. Thinking about mid-Canterbury irrigated farming systems, I suspect that's probably a large proportion of the farms down here. What would you think would be a way to try and move away from that, given the, you think about the cost structures and the...
Yeah. I'm not, it's so different to my own environment in the lower North Island. So I don't know what those economic constraints are, but I guess we've seen it in terms of farms where we had this whole wintering off of cows into cropping, winter grazing systems. I don't know where that's got to. I had, yeah, it's pretty standard, isn't it? Look, I don't know. I really feel that's too far out of my own realm, my own personal realm, to really be able to comment on. But I guess that things are pretty embedded in Canterbury in terms of the economic infrastructure, the economic investment that's gone into those farms. I don't know what flexibility they have around being able to change. I wouldn't have a clue. Sorry, I can't. Sorry, I haven't answered your question.
Dave, we'll take your question.
Thanks, Tony. I'm thinking back on the points you made about behaviour change. And, it's a little bit like where the last question came from. In the dairy industry, so I work in the dairy industry with dairy. The big elephant in the room, a big elephant in the room for us is the level of indebtedness in our industry. And we kind of wave our hands a bit and say, well, it just makes it so hard because it's one of these big distractions you talk about. People have got debt servicing, they've got the bank in their ear, saying, we need you to pay your debt. And that makes it very hard to get cut through on messages about sorts of things you've talked about. Then also, say behaviour change is difficult in that environment, we think. But then I also thought, well, you've been through periods in our agricultural industry when the same sort of, maybe not the same causes, but I think about the government changes in the 1980s. That
Correct.
burned a lot of energy out of farms and would have placed farmers in essentially a very simple position where their economic sustainability was seriously threatened. Now, what were your observations about dealing with farmers through that period and their receptiveness to information, messages and behaviour change when they had this sort of big economic sustainability thing hanging over them? And what should we be thinking about in our modern industry? It's not just dairy, but it's like we have with all the indebtedness in other industries as well.
Yeah, no, valid point, because Roger Douglas and the Labor government in the 84, 85, 86 really turned things upside down. I think the impacts were much greater in the sheep and beef sector than they were for dairying at that stage. But that resulted in massive changes in finance rates. We were dealing with 7% with state advances and people who were on 95% settlement loans with having purchased farms with 5% deposits, funded and supported as part of the land development. And we'd gone through people had made big capital investments through land development encouragement loan at cheap finance through the 77, 78, 79, 80, 81 with Piggy Muldoon. And so what happened then was suddenly the end of that decade we were at 21% interest rates. And there was tremendous economic upheaval. There were two things. There was the loss of wealth, but there was a tremendous loss of intellectual capital because there were a large number. The people that were most screwed were the young people who had heavily indebted themselves and bought farms at high levels of debt or had purchased recently with debt. And so they were the last cabs to the rank and they were the first cabs off. And so there was a tremendous impact on intellectual knowledge, enthusiasm, passion. We lost almost like a decades of new farmers at that stage out of the sheep and beef sector. And that took a long time to recover. What happened at that stage was because government was a provider of finance, it had gone from state advances and rural bank, not rural bank, it was state advance. Well, yes, it was rural bank, but it was government owned. So government did a whole lot of taking a haircut on rescinding debt on a whole lot of cases. So we had all these debt restructuring meetings where there was a degree of, if there was thought to be a hope, you know, I can't remember the type of level of amount of debt that got wiped. I can't recall. I'm about to find it out, but I can't recall it. And that's how people got through. But you know, life in some cases was a real bastard. No doubt about that. What it signalled at the same time was that a whole lot of partners suddenly went, you know, the road to Danneberg suddenly became a highway at about 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, because suddenly every wife went back to nursing or teaching if they could, or they went back to a job in town. And so that was how households survived. And it took some work. Willie Smith from Auckland University ourselves, it took another 15 years for people to get over that. So it was a long time. And that was throughout the North Island. So what are the lessons out of that? Well, and we're talking about this at 4% at the moment. So the room to move. I don't know. I mean, change of tenure isn't the way out, because all you're doing is saddling the next person onto the farm with the same level of debt. So that isn't an option. So I get a bit annoyed when people say, oh, well, I can't, you know, these changes are affecting my ability to be able to sell my farm to you. Well, why the hell should you be taking on my farm at these current land prices? And that's the issue. So we're going to see a reduction in land price. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It's going to happen, and people are going to take a haircut. It's the only way it can work. And how far the banks will go, I don't know. I really don't know. But I would see there's going to be some banks that are going to hurt, because in the process we had, if we think about the sheep and beef industry over the last 10 years, you know, land price appreciation has got them out of the last crisis. I can think, but you know, and that's allowed people to sell up and still keep some money. But this is so widespread, and it's across the dairy industry, which is such a large part of the financial lending market, that it's not going to be easy. It's going to be rough, and there are people going to have to take haircuts. Unfortunately, you know, so many of these things have been building for so long. It's not as though it's a 5-minute wonder. This has been going on for the last 25 years. I really wished I was arguing for capital gains tax, not because it was going to make an immediate difference, but because it was another incentive that was going to be there, that was trying to tell people that, you know, these gains. I went overseas in 2010, I think it was, and I had a client who was wanting to buy a piece of land. And luckily we went to Rabobank and they turned it down, thank goodness. I came back and they said, oh, we bought that bit of land. Another bank had stepped in and bloody well lent them. And then 2 years later was telling them they had to sell up. And they went for 6 years and destroyed equity, and really didn't walk off the place, but bloody near did. And so the mental anguish that they had over that time was bloody amazing. And that's cruel. But it's what people were doing as part of another commercial driver. You know, it was lent on capital rather than cash flow. I don't know what the answer is, Dave, but it's going to be significant.
That's probably a good place to end. I'm sure I know there's a few other hands that were up, and I apologise for that. But I'm sure Tony is free to talk for a few more minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you, everyone.
Very